Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. BlueSky is a social media site that is making big waves as of late. On this episode of the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, I'm joined by sociologist Karl Folk to discuss whether or not the site has the juice. We also discussed the Luigi Mangione case and what the response to it says about the state of society. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Karl, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, man. It's been a pretty crazy month.
Yeah, I couldn't say it any better myself. Frankly, like, this month has been one for the record books.
Seriously. I mean, we saw this horseshit election result none of us wanted. We saw the incoming president-elect announce the cabinet nominations of some of the biggest grifters and losers out there. We were briefly treated to the idea of Attorney General Matt Gaetz, who made sure to resign in advance of his appointment, he said, but probably more likely the House Ethics Commission report on his extracurricular activities is what really did it.
Yes.
And then you have notorious QAnon proponent Kash Patel up for FBI director. What the fuck, man?
Yeah,
nuts.
I don't even, like, at this point, I don't even know what to say, really. Like, we are getting literally the exact thing that we were told we were going to get, right? Which is a extremely dangerous, totally non-reality based administration, and we've got it.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. slated to head up Health and Human Services. And then, in a related story, Iron Lung Manufacturing Company stocks are at an all-time high. You have notorious 2020 election denier Carrie Lake from Arizona set to take over the Voice of America.
Better known now as American Pravda.
Seriously. And it seems like every time I turn on the damn TV, they're nominating some other chucklehead. You can't even look at this and be surprised. Like you said, these are all the same sycophants that have been surrounding him for years. We know he loves people who tell him how great he is, and he's just done with that reality. It's all about their reality here now, and we're in for a ride, folks. We are absolutely in for a ride. Nobody's really sure how this is going to go, but I don't think anybody thinks it's going to go well because, you know, Elon has been talking about how the country should be prepped for lots of economic pain, and when a billionaire tells you they're going to pick your pocket, you should probably believe them.
Yeah, and they've said it very clearly. They've said in the last 2 days their goal now is to take out the FDIC.
Oh, you mean the people who insure your bank account if you've got under $250,000 in it, which most people don't? Wow.
That is the exact one, and it's the one in the same that was set up directly to stop bank runs in the 1930s in the midst of the chaos.
Right. One of those things that, like, kind of kept the wolves from the door a little bit when it came to potentially like some kind of mass proletariat uprising as a result of the policies that got them into this place. Wow, you're going to take those away now?
Yeah, no, I think they're going for the we're gonna rob you blind and tell you it was someone else's fault plan.
That is what it's looking like right now.
Yes.
You know, the one good thing, however, that's come up in the last month since the election is that we finally have a credible alternative to Twitter. There's been a few attempts to start something like this, but none of them have been terribly successful up to now.
Yeah.
The social media platform BlueSky appears to have hit critical mass, and they're adding users as fast as they can, and you can feel the energy slip out of Twitter as they're doing it. It's crazy. There's this whole like concept of having the juice, and it very definitely seems like that's where BlueSky is right now.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I mean, Twitter's a dead mall, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of where we're at now. And, you know, BlueSky is different. A lot of people, early adopters, were there for the tech difference. Frankly, it looks and feels like Twitter for a lot of people, and that's why they're there. But it does offer some really new kind of views on like how to actually do certain things to keep yourself safer, and it works really well. They're doing a few things very, very right in how they've set up, like their block option is truly unique in that it, we call it the nuclear block for a reason over there, because it literally makes it so someone has zero ability to even see you exist on the service.
Yeah.
And that's huge, right? It also allows for public block lists, and that's something totally unique. I've never, in all of my years being online, it's very unique in some of that kind of respect where it's really made to protect you.
Yeah.
And it's changed the dynamic for me, at least, as someone who deals with the far right and bad actors online. It really does neuter their ability to move past a certain point.
Right. And it makes sure that they really just can't do a whole lot. I believe the extension for the nuclear block is entitled Blockenheimer.
Yes.
Cute. Well played. Well played,
Yeah.
guys. It's amazing.
It works really well.
Oh, yes, it does. And if you really don't want to deal with that person and maybe even all of their followers, you can use it, and it will block somebody and all of their followers. And, I'm not necessarily a proponent of that kind of mass blocking, but periodically you get somebody who's just going to be an asshole. And you find yourself kind of wanting to say, look, choose. You can follow, say, Jesse Singal, or you can follow me. If you choose to follow Jesse Singal, well, have fun being blocked. I'm not missing anything by not having you around. If I want to read your opinions, I'll just go back over to Twitter.
No, it's shocking how well it works. And like the actual block list feature that's public is quite impressive. I've been on the site since early on. I was given a invite in early 2023, and understanding how their self-moderation service works and their like list service works, where you build your block list and it becomes public, is really a game changer. I have, I guess, one of the larger far right lists on BlueSky, and it's shocking how well it works.
Right.
I didn't find out until 3 weeks after the fact that, like, I had Brianna Wu and some of the far right dorks on Twitter showing screen caps of my block list from BlueSky on Twitter, and I didn't know it happened. I didn't even know it happened, and I have a pretty constant influx of Nazis and other things on my account. So for me, it wasn't like a noticeable thing, but now that I know, it really just tells me how incredibly powerful their self-moderation tools are.
It is, really. And it's nice to be able to actually have a conversation over there now without having to worry about like the shitheads showing up and deciding to really just hijack things and ruin it. They aren't getting any traction over there at this point. So, BlueSky's got its issues. There's stuff that needs to get worked out. There's features I would love them to add, but for right now, it beats the absolute hell out of Twitter. And I hear people complaining a bit about the ownership, about some of the VC that helped start this in the first place. But it's like, guys, have you seen the VC behind Twitter? Do you know who owns that site these days? Almost anybody would be better to deal with.
No question. No question at all. Like, there are some issues, right? With any venture capital backed business, there are going to be problems.
Right.
And there are some issues that they definitely have to work out. But the fact that I can have a conversation with a huge amount of people and literally never see any kind of hate speech is refreshing. It's opened up something that I think for a lot of people they had forgotten existed, right? Like, it's opened up a space that is not constantly inundated with bad faith, right-wing argumentation. There's a fair amount of disagreement, right?
Right.
Like, it's definitely not a space where it's all like-minded individuals. But you actually get to have a nuanced conversation then between two people who do have opposing views on something without the constant barrage of sea lioning or just bad faith attacks or, Gish Gallop stuff. It's literally a different kind of space. It feels much more like the old internet where people had to kind of look out for themselves, but also it doesn't have just a constant drumbeat of fascist bullshit.
Yeah, and it's really been refreshing to have gone through a couple of big news cycles. Like we've had, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, thank God. And,
Yes.
The attempted coup in South Korea. And man, how nice was it to be able to track this stuff online and not have to deal with some of the bullshit that goes along with tracking this kind of thing on Twitter these days? Twitter used to be the absolute best way to follow breaking news, bar none. There was no better way to do it than Twitter at one point. But in the last, probably 5 years, it's gotten almost unusable.
No, I mean, it's truly, the difference is shocking, right? Like being able to watch in real time as something like the attempted coup in South Korea happened. I mean, that really, for me, was kind of cementing that this thing has the reach, the power, and the overall use now, where it's rivaling Twitter prior to its takeover, right? And
Right.
so that's a huge, huge difference. And the ability then to say, okay, well, this is good information coming from a good source who's on the ground, and not have any of the information warfare, for lack of a better word, that goes on Twitter, for example.
No, that's the best term for it. I mean, there are departments, government departments in a lot of places that are churning it out when these kinds of events happen to make sure that, the information environment is as shitted up as possible.
Oh, absolutely. No, and that's really, I think that's been one of the things for me as someone who pays far too much attention to that kind of thing and works, kind of in that world. Having an environment that's not inundated with truly bad information is such a breath of fresh air that I think for a lot of people who've ended up on BlueSky, it's given them space.
Definitely.
And, that's, I think, also why we're starting to see so much pushback from rival social media sites, but also from bad actors, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like there's a fair amount right now on BlueSky where you can see it in such stark relief compared to the average conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And because of these blocks, like there's really interesting activity that you can identify much easier now.
Right.
And, as an early adopter, much in the same way that you were.
Right. Yeah, I got over there pretty early myself. Not as early as you, but I got an invite like early 2023 as well, and it definitely has skyrocketed ever since then. There was hardly anybody on it when I got there, and now it's like, wow, this is insane.
Yeah. No, and the difference, I mean, the thing is, like in August and early September of this year, like they had their first really big influx because of Brazil banning Twitter.
Right, right.
Due to Musk doing the I'm going to threaten you with a coup, essentially.
The fuck around and the find out, as it were.
Yes. And, during that influx, I came across a very large network of far right and neo-Nazi trolls, and they were trying to use that chaos to get situated and grab a foothold on BlueSky. And they were very tenacious right-wing trolls.
Right.
And so, watching that and seeing how powerful the block lists were to the point where they were taking screen caps back to their website and trying to figure out a way around it, to the point of creating, I mean, they had created 250,000 accounts in like 4 days.
Uh-huh.
And so like I had gotten a number of those accounts immediately pulled. And at a certain point, what, I realized was they couldn't get through that wall.
Nope.
And because of the way that it's public, thousands of other users weren't seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my first experience with BlueSky's system, where I was like, oh, this actually is different in a fundamental way, which is it literally takes the wind out of a network of trolls trying to do this, out of their sails, right? Like it totally demotivates them from going forward. And now you just see it, right? Like you can just start to see, now that there's an actual user base, you start to see how they infiltrate.
Uh-huh. It's amazing that they cannot get that traction. And like you said, they're taking it back to Twitter. They're taking it back to 4chan in some cases.
Yeah.
They're sad. They're bummed about this. And it's like, good. Keep it going.
Yeah.
you see their tears and it just kind of keeps you realizing that you're absolutely doing the right thing over there.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting, right? Like now you can see kind of delineations, especially in kind of farmed content creation and like networks of accounts that aren't authentic.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see like that's something that you can clearly start to see when you actually block out some of the noise that's prevalent on a social media platform.
And we've already seen a lot of the same people who helped ruin Twitter on their way over here.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found very interesting was that when some of the grifters from Twitter who made the place pretty miserable showed up, people like yourself, myself, were able to push back on them and say, you know what? You ruined the last social media platform. We can't stop you, but we can at least make you aware of the fact that part of the reason that platform sucked is you.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you come over here and you do the same thing, then we are going to put you on block lists. We are going to tell everybody why we think that you're such a terrible thing to have around. This isn't going to be the way it was before. You're going to get pushback.
And that's been one of the most interesting things with BlueSky in my mind is the culture that's been created there, right? And like we have a true vision of what the internet can be and what social media can be. And I think, seeing some of the names that have come over, and I have found myself with a following that is shocking and engagement that's shocking compared to places like Twitter, even at its height. It's a very different thing. And so for me and you and others who have been dealing with conspiracy theorists specifically, one of the things that BlueSky does really well is as someone who is on there early and as someone who has taken a little time to read through how things work, like their block lists are nuclear weapons against bad actors if utilized correctly. And, I operate one of the largest, I guess, block lists on BlueSky that's exclusively for the far right and then also for kind of bad actors that slip into liberal circles. And I can tell you, as someone who never had any experience with moderation in the sense of having any control over it, it's shocking the power that good moderation gives to the users.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see how well they work in the pushback against these tools on the platform. And some of it's coming from grifters and some of it's coming just from outright bad people who want to manipulate the platform and harm its core user base.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've seen a few of these grifters get really frustrated and mad and start making what are only to be interpreted as death threats.
Yes.
And they got their accounts taken down real fast as a result of that. It was very refreshing to see that happen as opposed to over on Twitter where no one's going to care.
Right.
I mean, we know this because we've seen this for the last several years. Nobody cares what they say on Twitter, but over here we see a death threat or two and it's like they're gone. And they're back over on Twitter complaining about, oh, I was inauthentically suspended. It's like, tell your fan base what you said. Just tell your fan base what you said. That's all. See if they think it was inauthentic at that point.
Exactly. It's been really interesting. And I pointed it out kind of quietly a few days ago, but like I had no idea that my block lists were being shared as screen caps by Barry Weiss and a whole host of the far right kind of bad faith brigade on Twitter because my lists had covered them so thoroughly on BlueSky that I literally just didn't see them, and I'm not on Twitter anymore. So for me, it was the first moment where I just had the full on, oh well, this is actually working better than I had ever thought moderation would work, but it leaves some holes as to interpretation as well from the actual company, which is we're starting to see that too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that are complaining that they don't like the fact that they ended up on these lists. I can think of a few people specifically, and the answer that they get is, you may not espouse far-right politics in theory, but you cozy up with far-right
Yep.
actors, and some of your narratives are indistinguishable from what the far-right people say. So you are kind of hanging out in the Nazi bar, pal.
Yeah.
You may not like that phrase, you may not like that concept, but if you are hanging out in the Nazi bar, you are going to be assumed that you're a Nazi.
I think that's such a massive cultural shift.
Yeah.
Just the space it's given day-to-day users to say, this isn't what I want to be around. This isn't the kind of environment I want to be in. This isn't the kind of logic I want to see exerted around me.
Yeah.
That's something that's incredibly powerful because it proves that there's another way. And if the whole story from certain companies is there's nothing we can do about it, there's no way to protect our users, well, this kind of destroys that story.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And we can now point to it and say, you guys are full of shit when you say that you can't do anything about it, that you can't clamp down on some of this speech. Yes, you
Absolutely.
can. You
Yeah.
don't want to, because the entire reason you bought the platform was to facilitate that kind of speech.
Yes.
And eventually people are going to get sick of showing up for this. You know, there's an old Henry Rollins bit I've been trying to find. It was on one of his live albums where he talks about the concept of like, what if people just stopped showing up for the beatings? What if people just wouldn't do any of the horrible crap anymore? What if you couldn't give away alcohol and guns and all this other stuff? It's kind of like, what if you just stop dealing with these people? And I think BlueSky is a great example of what that looks like when you stop dealing with these people. They can't stand the fact that they have been so effectively frozen out of that platform. It drives them crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
They go back over to Twitter and they cry.
It's the reactionary thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, unfortunately, doesn't know party lines in this country, right? Like we have like the true reactionaries. Yes, we have the far right reactionary types, but we also have extremely reactionary, moderate and centrist and conservative elements that have thought to themselves for a long time and been accepted by society for a long time as being rational voices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, this is the same argument that like the woke arguments by the far right are built on too, where it's you're not accepting the oppositional view, which is inherently dangerous, into the conversation. So that makes you a threat because if we can't set the narrative, you can.
Right. Right.
And if you can tell the story in a more effective way than we can, then we're in danger, not you.
Yeah.
And that's an incredibly, I think, important point to all of this is like, at the end of the day, they're worried about the story that's being told about America because it implicitly paints them as the villain, not because they're the villain. They like being the villain, but they can't stand that people see them that way. They have to be seen as the patriots, the true Americans, right?
Right. Right. They're the good guys.
They try and tie it to the history of our emancipation from Britain. And that's purely for that reason. If they could figure out how to say, well, the South, was the true inheritors, they would go to them. I mean, it's really simply a power game now. And the messaging reflects that because they're not interested in government.
Yeah.
And so you see that now with the online space where it's, well, they don't accept that we're going to tell them that these people aren't human. And that somehow makes them the bad guy because my ideas are as important as theirs. And so there's they really don't understand a fundamental part of this is we're not rejecting just them. We're creating a space to reject their story because it's a lie.
And it comes back to that. And we've talked about that, you and I, you've talked about it ad nauseum at this point, that we need to start telling better stories. And this is part of how we do it. At some point, we need a space where there's enough oxygen to get started telling that story. We need to be able to have that space to talk to each other again and breathe and try to find out, like, hey, what do these people think is important? How do we talk to other people that are not necessarily on that side of things? Because it's one thing they've proven over the years, they can shit up a conversation like nobody's business. They have
Yes.
made it virtually impossible to have conversations almost across the aisle. They're like, you should talk to these people over here. You're not, hearing enough of their views. Well, I can't hear enough of their views because you keep talking and you keep interjecting into this
Yep.
conversation. And at some point, we get rid of the people whose goal is to basically act as chaos agents. We can have that conversation again.
Yes.
Even if the people who we're talking to's politics don't necessarily match ours, that doesn't matter. We can have a conversation with those people without the people whose whole mission in life is to make sure that we fight with each other.
Well, exactly. I mean, right. So we're floating in a bunch of different pools, and there's always been this
Right.
there's always been a cultural moderator in there, right? Like either a newspaper or some kind of, middle person, and that cut out a lot of the ability to have a direct conversation. That's been switched up now by media online, but it's the same voices, right? With guys like Matty Iglesias, like he's a cultural moderator, right? Where it's we have to find somewhere in the center that's always center to right. It's never actually center, and God forbid it's ever, it would never go left. And that ratchet, the cultural ratchet, like we've done that forever here, but we broke loose of it in the interwar period, specifically after the civil rights movement. We really got away from some of that. There's still a huge conservative movement, all of that, but they just didn't have the power to do what they wanted, which was end segregation. So they worked for 60 years to get us here, and now people still reject them because it's not just like that they were unappealing at the time. Most people in this country are of the idea that this country is about doing what you want at a certain level, right? Like the land of the free, all of these things are about like finding your own story and your own path through life. And so when you have a bunch of people being like, well, our story is actually more important than you making your own, it gets dicey really quickly.
Yeah, very dicey. And there's a lot of be careful what you wish for out there right now when it comes to this kind of thing. In a somewhat related story, we saw easily one of the kind of most shocking events that we've seen in recent memory. Allegedly, a gentleman by the name of Luigi Mangione gunned down the CEO of United Health, Brian Thompson, in New York City on a sidewalk. And the reaction has been nothing short of astonishing amongst pretty much everybody. And I want to be very clear here. I don't think shooting the people that you disagree with for any reason is a good idea. I don't support political violence. Go back and listen to every episode of this podcast. I have been very consistent about this. Political violence is not something that I think we want. This is not a road we want to go down. It doesn't end anywhere good. This is something that we have to stay away from as much as we possibly can. But at this point, we have seen a guy basically assassinate a CEO in broad daylight, and he became a hero. People picked up on this and people started making, I saw tattoos of this guy's face. People started memeing him. They started calling him the claims adjuster. It was just insane. I've never seen a reaction quite like this for something along these lines. And it seems to have crossed every, political and class line out there, unless you're a billionaire. They don't seem too happy about any of this, but beyond them, you have people that are just cheering for this guy.
Yeah, we're in a really special spot socially right now, right? Like we've seen inequality grow at a rate that truly is insane, for lack of a better word, over the last 25 years. And I don't think you're going to achieve anything with political violence.
Yeah.
And I'm very much against how this country frames violence. So I'm willing to give a little bit more leeway than a lot of people, but there's no way that this leads in a direction that goes well for any of us.
No.
Because ultimately, these people that now are going to inhabit the White House want the kind of scary headlines this produces to do their will at this point, and that's a bad direction.
Yeah.
With that being said, the narrative creation over the last week and the folklore aspect of this and the literal folk hero status this person has achieved is mind-boggling to see it happen in real time when we've heard historic social and in the moment contemporary reports of how it happened. It's still unbelievable to see. And folk heroes in this country, we like a good folk hero that's perceived to be against the big bully. And you go back to the 30s when this was much more prevalent. Similarly, though, chaotic insofar as like the political environment around wealth and Wall Street and who was perceived to have power. And like we really like it when people stick it to the man.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's really powerful to see in real time. Like the night that I saw 30 different videos of this person's assassination, and they were all set to different songs, and they were all different levels of memeified violence. I had this moment of like, well, here we go. Nothing's ever going to be the same again because this has power in a way that a lot of people don't fully recognize, especially those who are like, in the class this is aimed at. They've walled themselves off effectively from the general population for so long now that they really do not have a barometer for what could be in this country.
Yeah. They don't understand it because they simply just don't. They don't interact.
No, they don't
with that.
exist.
They've bubbled themselves. They've walled themselves off.
They just don't exist with us, right? Especially the plus 10, 20, $30 million club. You don't interact with the world the same way we do as normal consumers.
Yeah, no, not at all.
And like, that's a really interesting kind of look at how and why I think some of the reaction to this has been almost a stutter step in how media and how journalism and things sometimes react to these kind of shocking events. And I think that just says how much power this really has. Because, like, one side knows how to message on this, and that side, unfortunately, is the one that has the ability to say, look, 90% of Americans have had an experience with healthcare that is so demeaning and undignified and unambiguously cruel that we just are going to kind of check out from this conversation. That says something massive about the moment we actually find ourselves in more completely.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that really kind of struck me about all of this, looking at what the guy had to say about it, looking at some of his social media postings, the guy posted a review on the book site Goodreads of the Unabomber Manifesto, Ted Kaczynski's screed about modern society and how we were screwing everything up. And he was very complimentary about it.
Yep.
He had a problem with the fact that innocent people got killed under what Kaczynski was doing, but he called him a political revolutionary.
That's the thing. First thing I said after this to a friend of mine when they asked me was, this guy reads like a Ted Kaczynski style act, because like, this is obviously someone who understood how to craft a story about himself. You don't just leave a backpack full of Monopoly money after you commit a crime if you're not trying to set up a second act, right? Like, there's this is a real interesting guy. He seems to be, I mean, he was very well educated. He holds multiple degrees. He was at Stanford for a while. I mean, this is not someone who is, what we normally in this country associate with like acts of violence, but it's entirely in the mold of a certain type.
Exactly. And he seems to have really just struck a nerve with America, with the world to some extent. He's really managed to capture a certain chunk of the imagination And, a woman went to jail in Florida recently because she was on the phone fighting with Blue Cross Blue Shield, her insurance company, and she ended the call with delay, deny, depose, you're next, and hung up on them. At which point they called it in as a threat. She was arrested.
Just don't say you're next in any kind of capacity ever.
Yeah, that's not good. That's really not good. Don't call in threats. Don't call in
Yeah.
threats to people. Don't
Yeah,
swat people. Don't do any of that kind of stuff. It's terrible.
It's the equivalent of Fed posting online. Don't do it. You will be much happier not doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you want to see what the inside of jail looks like, then
Right.
go ahead. But you don't. You really don't. You will go to jail at this point.
Uh-huh.
And if you don't want to go to jail, then saying you're next is probably not something you want to do.
Yeah, just don't call the threat in.
Right. Like I said, I do not believe in political violence. I do not believe that this is a good route to go down. I think that it ends up in a real bad place when we do this. However, there's always that however. The insurance companies themselves, the HMOs, have proven over the time since, Brian Thompson was assassinated, that they are going to reward this behavior. We saw Anthem and a collection of other people decide that they weren't going to pay anesthesiologists their going rate.
Bold choice.
That story broke the day Brian Thompson was assassinated. They basically were making it sound like, we'll pay for 45 minutes of an hour procedure because they didn't like the rate the anesthesiologists were trying to charge. Let's be real.
Yep.
They walked it back the very next day. Oh, we didn't actually mean that. And, things get out without being properly vetted. I would have bought that if the thing that happened the day before didn't happen.
Yes.
We saw, Alliance forgive a whole bunch of medical debt for a whole bunch of people since this all happened. And everybody's thinking, wow, they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. No, they're not. They're terrified.
That's a PR campaign.
Uh-huh.
This is purely the please don't get the wrong impression from this. And ironically, by doing what they've done, like you said, they've now given this a lot more power than it would have had otherwise, because essentially they've said this person's act got us to act.
Mm-hmm.
And to borrow from the actual anarchists, like the power of the deed, that claim was born out of years of brutal, violent action against different states. And if Anthem is going to, do what they've done, if United Healthcare is going to do what they've done, this PR campaign is actually far more dangerous for them than not doing it.
Yes, because what you've just explained to a whole lot of people who most people would refer to as normies is something you'll hear kicked around in activist circles a lot. And that phrase is direct action gets the goods.
Exactly.
You have decided to reward this behavior, guys. You have decided that because you're making a business decision here that you can't protect your CEOs, you can't protect the people on the high level, you're going to give people essentially what they are asking for here. You are letting the terrorists win. And this is a choice that you have made now, and you have made people realize that this is something you're prepared to do if people scare you enough. And I'm not sure that's a choice I would have wanted to make in a country with 1.5 guns for every man, woman, and child. When you have cut off mental health care for a lot of people, you have shredded the safety net. You have made it incredibly hard for people in some cases to even get medicine if you have ADHD and you haven't been suffering as a result of shortages. Man, God bless you. But you have basically given people a whole lot less options with how they're going to cope with things. But we have a lot of guns in this country. This is bad.
Yeah. It's a terrible mix, right? Like this historically is the mix that has truly massive repercussions. And, it's the kind of things that Trump has proposed now, going after the FDIC, going directly for people's money in that kind of way at the banking level. They've kind of painted themselves into a box here now, especially after this, where people are very much more becoming aware of just how privileged the wealth class is and just how far they're willing to go to maintain, grow, and build more wealth. And I think that we really, I mean, truly, this is one of those acts that has the ability to change not just a company's PR like they've done now, but truly like force a confrontation between the two realities, right? And that's something that like we haven't seen in this country in a long time, where there's an actual pierce the veil moment where you start to say, okay, well, Trump has put 13 or 14 billionaires into positions of power. Trump himself is wealthy. Not going to argue how much, but he's wealthy, or was.
The perception is that he is wealthy.
You know, you have the, yes, I think that's more fair. And you have a situation, though, where now, like, this inequality in not just our healthcare, but like in the whole system, because, as you said, the social safety net's gone. Increasingly, community that normally goes with society is gone. So people are lonely. They're looking for answers. We've got a situation here that really is a big pile of kindling. And when you get to a situation where people are starting to do direct action of the kind that we saw, in their mind, direct action, like that's the kind of thing that for them, for people especially outside of those circles at the like wealth side, they're going to run into serious problems. Like Peter Thiel's interview this week, they can't message out of. He sat and stammered when Piers Morgan asked him about the assassination.
And to those who think this shooter is a hero because he did it because he said this healthcare executive was presiding over a healthcare system which kills thousands of Americans by denying them cover, what would you say to them?
It's I don't know what to say. I think I still think you should try to make an argument, and I think this is you should, you know, there may be things wrong with our healthcare system, but you have to make an argument, and you have to try to find a way to convince people and change it by that.
And it's this kind of culture-wide stutter on their part has been louder than any reaction I've ever seen to a public act of violence.
Yeah, they are terrified right now because the way this happened, no one saw it coming. No one had this guy on the radar. No one knew who he was. No one cared who he was until he put on the mask, as the saying goes.
Right? Yeah.
But he basically just came out of nowhere. And sadly, the next one probably will too.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting, the overarching thing here that we've seen, right, is whether it's been the attempts on Trump's life or this now, these are conservative folks who obviously have, you know, had serious repercussions from this world that they live in.
Yeah.
And it's turned into violence really quickly. You know, the story is one thing. This American folklore that's going on is one thing, because that's a mirror of the people creating it, not the person doing the act. It's how it was with Pretty Boy Floyd.
Yeah. 20,000 people showed up at his funeral.
Exactly.
And they weren't all making sure he was dead.
No. And that's just it, right? Like, we do this thing, and it's important to note, though, like, the actual thing here is this is a grind culture by appearances. You know, kind of someone who is obsessed with grind culture, with some other kinds of like more crypto aligned stuff, it looks like, and more conservative beliefs. It's telling that the country turned them in, you know, this person into a folk hero. of the kind that they did, that's being used to raise kind of class consciousness and kind of point to the class war over the culture war. When you have that, it's just a very fluid situation for people who want to counter message against that.
Yeah, and this is something that we're going to be looking at more of probably in the future. We have kicked a hornet's nest, as you said, that we don't entirely understand the whole of and the why of.
Yeah.
And we are at a point now where we've given people something that they didn't know that they wanted until they had it. And now people are looking at this and going, and that's not a good place to be in. This really isn't.
No, it isn't. And I think I don't know. It's very interesting because people are starting to put things together in a very interesting way. When you start to see culture war icons getting comments that are not just negative on what they were saying about the shooting, but also on the mindset that they've put out there, this is something much bigger than people, I think, realize. This is something that is truly American, right? Like this crosses political boundaries, geographic areas. I mean, this is one of those ones where, like, when inequality really is pointed out in a big way, we tend to react.
Yeah, and this is what people are doing right now. It's a reaction. We have to hope that there isn't too much more of this, but I'm kind of afraid that this is something we can't necessarily stop. I'm afraid that we have gotten to a point in the discourse where people have realized that this is somewhere they want to go. So really, the billionaires in the Trump administration, the people who are planning to loot the place, if any of you are listening, which I kind of doubt, but you never know. We have some listeners who, shock me every so often. If you're listening, you've got a choice to make. You have to understand that part of the reason Franklin Delano Roosevelt rolled out the New Deal was because he was legitimately, and they were at the time, legitimately scared that there would be a communist revolution in this country. Things were that bad.
Yes.
At that point, in 1932.
Yes.
People were terrified of the idea that communism was starting to look better and better because things were so bad for the average person at that point.
It's why fascism was in vogue too, right? Like people were looking for alternative.
Yeah. And you have to understand that, like, you have the choice now. You can either stop messing with the very basics of people's security, or you can keep doing this and see where it happens. Now, keep fucking around and we're all going to find out.
Well, we're all going to find out regardless now that we know what's kind of coming from Trump. So that's just going to heighten this whole kind of dissonance now, right? Is like we also have a population that's getting geared up to get kicked in the teeth by an authoritarian. And so for me, this is a real interesting kind of inflection point for how we as a population start to actually organize.
Yeah.
Because now people are starting to think across not just like, well, Trump's a fascist, here's why, but also like, we're going to get robbed. Every single American is going to get robbed by these people.
Mm-hmm.
It's just sometimes coincidence and timing come together in such a unique way that it's just mind-boggling. And right now, the intersection of what has turned into a pretty interesting conversation about wealth, that's broadening quickly enough that some of this is starting to really turn into something even bigger than the initial act. And I think it's we're in a very interesting space here.
We are, and it'll be interesting as things progress to see where this continues to go, because we're going to have to make some real choices real fast as a society. And I hope we make the smart ones. I really do.
Well, I think, I think that's true. And I think what's interesting is this is all just little snippets of American history condensed into one period, right? Like we're getting the backlash against Reconstruction and that wrapped into like the Gilded Age view of we're going to eat your profit for every meal. And we're also dealing with a truly fascist element. And so, we're getting kind of snippets of different parts of our history. And The bigger story in all of those, though, is usually like the population is generally on the side of, well, this seems like a problem. Do we need to fix it? And it takes some cajoling. It takes some time and it takes a few punches, but we do try, we do generally see the world as like full of good people for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And we hope that they're still out there. We hope that this is the time that good people are going to start to step up because, wow, things are really precarious. Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.